One of the extensive things that are used within the New Testament is the use of Tanakh quotes. And almost all the writers at some point will quote from Tanakh. Now, when they do that, we need to see that, again, the way in which they do that wouldn't always make professors very happy. Professors want you to quote exactly what your reference said and put it in inverted commas so that you can know who it's coming from and to give you the reference. Of course, the concept of referencing isn't in the New Testament. Effectively, they say things like, from as the prophet Isaiah wrote. Of course, they don't give you verse numbers and chapter numbers. And of course, the reason for that is because in the time of Jesus, there were no such thing as chapter numbers and verse numbers. There was just the scroll of Isaiah. And you would need to know the scroll well enough to be able to know where in that scroll the particular verse you were looking for. But on top of that, the gospel writers not only quote from the Tanakh, but sometimes they even change the Tanakh's writing. So they seem to have no problem with having to quote exactly what was written in Tanakh. A prime example of that is the quote in Matthew, where he talks about a virgin shall be with child, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. Now, in fact, in the original version of that, it doesn't say virgin, it says a maiden shall be with child. Now, you may say, well, that's more or less the same thing. And yes, it is, but there was no compulsion in Matthew to say, I have to write it exactly the way in which it was written in Tanakh, the way in which it was written exactly in Isaiah. There was no compulsion to say it has to be exact. And the reason why is because for them it was more important to convey meaning than the actual words. The meaning, the purpose was the process. Now, as we've discussed when we looked at prophecy within the Tanakh, it wasn't a sense of fulfillment of prophecy as a foretelling concept. That somehow Isaiah was saying, well, you see, I'm foretelling Jesus. That's not how Matthew did it. Rather, what Matthew says is that Jesus is a fulfillment of Isaiah. Josiah, Hezekiah would also have been fulfillments of Isaiah, but this was a fulfillment. And so therefore it fits within the framework of Jewish thinking. Now, of course, for us, some of us, we actually find it very hard to connect with that because we've been taught that all prophecy is about foretelling. And so therefore when Jesus does certain things, it's as it was foretold. Well, the Jewish understanding of foretelling is different to that. It's not fortune telling. It's not somehow predicting the future, and now Jesus is the fulfillment of that prediction. But rather saying that just as the prophecy was written, so now Jesus is a fulfillment of that. That Jesus is connected to the Old Testament. That Jesus, and the faith that we can have in Jesus, connected to the faith of the prophets. And the word of the prophets connected to Jesus. Now, when we see it like that, all of a sudden, we have a much broader view of it. And we can understand why they can change some of the words. They can even leave out some of the phrases. In fact, Jesus himself uses the first line of Psalm 22 on the cross. When he quotes, he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my Lord, or my God, why have you forsaken me? When we read that, for us, we can get into a theological debate about whether God was there and did sin cut him off. But in fact, if we see it instead as a link into the Old Testament, we realize that if we read Psalm 22, that it is a psalm of a seeming sense of dereliction, a sense of being by yourself. And yet when we read through the rest of the psalm, what we find out that is in fact the writer realizes that he's never alone. That in fact God never leaves him even when he feels alone. Now, when you look at it like that, all of a sudden we understand there's God. God never leaves Jesus. In fact, how could God possibly leave Jesus on the cross? When in fact Paul tells us that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing. Nothing in heaven, nothing on the earth, nothing below the earth. Nothing can separate us from God. So why would God separate himself at that point? And so what we see within this is a very clear understanding of the fact that they use the Tanakh in order to bolster, in order to help understand that which is happening within Jesus' life. And what it does is it connects Jesus directly into the full story of Israel. The story that comes from Genesis chapter 1 and moves all the way through into his life. That the Tanakh is used as the link, as the part that links Jesus into that full history and narrative of the chosen people. And of course, as we connect into Jesus, so we become part of that same story, part of that same narrative. So when we read the quotes from the Old Testament, when we read the quotes from the Tanakh, let's always be aware of the intent of them. In fact, go back and read the Tanakh section so that you have a sense of what was the Tanakh section saying originally. And then you will notice how sometimes it's being reused in a new way, in a new interpretation, in order to actually meet the needs of the writers of the New Testament.